Hey, welcome back to our channel. My name is Ray, and I'm an associate clinical social worker. I'm also here today, lucky to be meeting with Cece Garrett, who is also a clinical social worker located in Washington. And Cece's practice is called Lightening the Load Counseling. I'm here to kind of talk about, kind of open the conversation up around hoarding and both your experience kind of personally and professionally. Would you mind introducing yourself to folks?
Sure. Like you said, my name is Cece Garrett, and I live in Central Washington, and I'm primarily telehealth. I do have a couple of local clients, but overwhelmingly do work through telehealth. I've been doing this now for 12 years, but I actually have, we joke in circles, we joke like I have the most experience that anybody has because I actually grew up with a parent who hoards. And so by the time I was 4, we lived alone. And probably by the time I was 6 or 7, the house started getting significantly cluttered. And so I had an um, upfront view of what hoarding is. And to be clear, like I left home as quickly as I could when I finished high school, thought about running away. Um, and there was a lot of stress between my mom and I. And some of it's related to the condition of the home. A lot of it was related to the symptoms that really underlie hoarding that maybe we don't talk about a ton. You know, emotional dysregulation is a pervasive piece of what's happening behind those collecting behaviors. And that makes it really difficult to be a kid when your parents dysregulated. So kind of walked away from my mom, kept some distance. The challenge, of course, was what my experience was traumatic. And so having distance didn't actually mean I was okay. It meant I was constantly waiting for the time when I was going to have to do something. And that time actually happened in 2009. My mom fell. Her home had become more significantly cluttered. And it was always squalid, but it actually really reached a critical point. She went into septic shock, nearly died. And at that point, I was in Washington State, where I am now, but at that point, she was still on the East Coast. And so we had this very difficult fall, which landed us on the show Hoarders in 2009, season 2, which I know for some people who may be jumping into this, they're going to be like, "Oh, I hate that show." Cool, right? Like I'm not telling anyone that they should be on the show or that they should watch the show. But it was a very good experience for us. In fact, for me, sitting in the first day, they do all of these interviews, and it was the first time I'd ever talked to anybody about what my childhood was like. And, you know, they hadn't even interviewed my mom yet. We'd been to the house, they'd done this, but they hadn't even met my mom yet. And the therapist there, Dr. Moore, she said, "Cece, no matter what happens this weekend, promise me, promise me with aftercare, you're going to go start getting some counseling for you." Um, and so I think that is right up front. If you're watching this, especially if you're somebody who has a family member, especially a parent who has hoarding disorder, go get counseling for yourself. Before you try to do anything else, get okay with you. And I'll share a little bit more why that's so important. So in 2009, we did that. We moved her across the country to be closer to us, and trying to find support to help her maintain was challenging. And in 2012, I stumbled across Buried in Treasures and started doing the groups in Spokane. Decided later, hey, this would be easier if I was actually a licensed provider. So I got my bachelor's in psych and then my social work, clinical social work, MSW in 2000. What year is that? 21. Good old pandemic. And so, you know, I came into that practice already well established, have worked with hundreds of individuals and families over the past 12 years, and really love the opportunity to educate from the view of what it's like to actually live with somebody, because I think that that's a piece that research just doesn't represent well, and to really help families see why it's so hard for them too.
Thank you so much for like introducing yourself and sharing a bit about your background. And I heard you, right, talk about like what we don't see represented in research or right in media. And I'm curious, what would you like to see represented, or like how do we kind of address this gap?
Yeah, I think, having been in this for over a decade, generally going to every training I can get my hands on. And the same information is disseminated. So we go through the DSM, we go through those 3 to 5 required symptoms. And that's great. Like we need somewhere to diagnose, but what the DSM, and that's clear on every disorder, what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell us why. And so something I feel like is definitely missing is the underlying vulnerabilities that create this symptomology. So the need to save, inability to let go, overwhelming clutter. Okay, great. It's like a cough. Like, is it whooping cough? Is it COVID? Is it smoke? Right? Like, because if we don't know what's happening there, we can't adequately deal with it. And so it's interesting because we do have a lot of research. We have the CBT model of hoarding, which talks about these underlying vulnerabilities. And Tolan has published just about a year ago now a biopsychosocial model, which builds a little bit more broadly into some things we're learning through neuroscience about the brain. But that's the piece that I think families really need to be learning, and clinicians need to be learning, community providers need to be learning. And the other piece I think is really important is I was having a conversation with a colleague recently, and they said, you know what, that's great, Cece, that you're doing all that work. But just so you know, our clients overwhelmingly are single people who don't have family. And when I was going back and rereading through some of the research and some of the tomes, we do see that represented, that in the research, the people who have reached out are overwhelmingly single adults. And so we look at generalizability, and it's like, how much does what we have in the research match up to those like myself who have a parent? One, my mom nearly died before she began to admit there was a problem. And even it's so funny, because my story is recorded for eternity. Like you can go on YouTube and watch it, right? But she would say, well, it got bad in the last couple of years. Well, that was 2009. I'm going to age myself here. I was born in 76. And like I said, it was bad by probably 82 to 1984. So it didn't get bad in the early 2000s. It was bad always, right? So it's kind of interesting, that lack of insight. And so the question has to be of what is research missing? And I think that we need to do that anytime we have research is what are the outliers? Where are the places where what we've collected data-wise maybe doesn't fit all of the population, and how do we supplement that? And I think that's an important thing for families is to recognize those vulnerability issues, those underlying distress. When we see that, it's causing significant distress, what we're not hearing is we're talking about individuals who are highly dysregulated. And highly dysregulated parents are not safe, fun parents. And so even if you take away the clutter, you have an environment that emotionally is challenging for a kid. And the tools that the parent is modeling, because a lot of my clients right now are second generation, their parents had hoarding behaviors as well. And one of them said to me, he's like, it makes so much sense that I do this because this is how I learned to control my emotions. And so that's something I think that really we need to do more about, is normalizing that children who are coming out of these families their experiences may not be well represented by the research that's out there. And also really leaning in with the trauma-informed scope of what might be happening if you had a dysregulated parent, if you had a parent with OCPD, if you had a parent who was dependent personality disorder, a parent with ADHD. Means you have a parent who can't be relied upon, not because they're necessarily bad, but because their brains jump around so much, they can't do the things that maybe a child needs. And so coming back to what might that experience look like, and in challenging, like Dr. Moore did, Cece, whatever else happens, go get counseling for you, right? I didn't choose it, but this was my world. And the good news is my mom didn't have to be part of that for me to start getting better.
Mm.
And I think that that's another piece, is recognizing that sometimes family members do have to step away to get better, because there's no ability to help anyone. Put your own mask on first, right? That's what they tell you when you get on the plane. Put your own mask on first. And that's not what we're getting a lot of right now.
And that kind of makes me think of a question around like, what would you like, children of parents who hoard, what would you like them to know, kind of based on your experience, both as somebody with like lived experience as an adult child of a parent, like as well as somebody who also works in mental health?
Whew, how much time do we have? I think the number one piece is, it's not your fault. Is, the child brain, as we know this developmentally as children, we believe that we are, in fact, the effectors of all the things that happen around us. That's just part of how the brain develops. Um, but when you have a parent then with mental health challenges, it's really easy to have language, and a dysregulated parent is going to say things that they don't necessarily mean. And then you have a child whose brain is already believing. I mean, we see this in divorce, right? The kid's like, oh, I can't believe I didn't eat my green beans. Now mom and dad are getting divorced. That's not why mom and dad are getting divorced, but that's how the brain works. We see that in family therapy. We know that. Um, but we aren't necessarily applying that same thing to these kids, to kids like me. And to be clear, like, I don't know that my mom blamed me all the time, but I can tell you there were times where my mom made comments like, well, if you didn't require so much time, if we didn't have to go do so many things, I could stay home and clean the house more. And the pervasive message, on top of the fact that I already had that self-centered, egotistical brain, that's just how a child's wired, is this is my fault. Then you add those potential trauma. And to be clear, I'm not saying that every person who has a parent who hoards is a trauma victim. I'm going to say a lot more are than we've given credit, based on the fact that emotionally dysregulated parents, which we also now are calling emotionally immature parents, lack the skills to teach a kid how to self-soothe and self-regulate. That's just a really natural place for trauma, not big T trauma, but traumatic events to occur. And that we also know trauma bonding is a thing, right? How do we respond? Some people respond by fawning. So learning skills first to self-regulate yourself, and recognizing you may never be able to get your parent to feel better, to get care. But what you can do is be okay in your body, in your mind, even if they never do. And that's really hard when we love, even kids who have horribly abusive parents love their parents. I think we're designed that way because as children we need caregivers, right? It's one of those mysteries. But so I think that would be the big thing, is it's not your fault. Go learn some skills. Believe it or not, you can be okay even if your parent makes horrible, horrible decisions and never gets help. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes when you do that, you can shift the cycle. We look at family systems. How do we change a family? All it takes is one person. And sometimes I believe that's why my mom did get better, was because I did go seek my own help. Now, it cost me, you know, it definitely cost me some stuff still, emotional turmoil. But that would be my biggest thing, is start with your own counseling. Go get a good trauma informed therapist who's going to teach you how to self-regulate, who's going to help you learn how to recognize your triggers. I had somebody reach out to me through the internet last week and said, hey, there was a house fire next door. My house filled with smoke. and I grew up in a hoarding environment and I feel like I need to move. Should I move? I was like, well, I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is it makes a lot of sense that having that experience freaked you out.
Mm.
Go do some trauma work. Get to a point where smoke doesn't freak you out like that. Because I don't know if you can ever live somewhere where that's not a risk, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that would be, I think, my biggest thing is just know it's not your fault. And I think a second close to it would be there's a lot of talk about compassion. Um, be compassionate with yourself first. I made that mistake, and it's something that I continue to have to go back. I became compassionate. My mom has a mental illness. Oh, okay, okay. Oh, so I'm so compassionate. But then if we lead with that first, developing compassion for our parents, what ends up happening then is, well, then I shouldn't feel bad because I'm compassionate to the fact that my mom had a mental illness. No, both are true. And so I definitely always lead my clients to self-compassion first. We can come back to develop compassion for our parents later, but start here because this is the one at the end of the day I'm responsible for and who's my brain, my heart is what's going to keep me awake at night, not whether I'm being compassionate to my mom. So
Mhm. And I really appreciate like this example you give of like how, right, like children can be compassionate to themselves, like that being compassionate to like parents, right? Like I understand and like I feel for my parent who is struggling with a mental illness. And it could also be true that, I've also been impacted or I'm struggling. So I'm hearing you say like compassion for another person doesn't mean that we can't also recognize like our own struggles. Yeah.
yeah.
And on the flip side, right, we just talked about kind of what you would like kind of, children of parents to know, but I'm curious, like, is there anything that you would like, parents who are experiencing like hoarding related challenges, what would you like them to know?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a good one, Ray. It's like nobody's ever asked me that one. Now I'm all like, but what I have, I do. Obviously, I work with a lot of people who have hoarding behaviors as well as adult children, and and I think that what I often hear um, from them. In fact, one of the earliest conferences I presented at, a woman came up to me afterwards, and she said to me, "Cece, I have a hoarding disorder, um, and I never considered that it might have negative impacts on my daughter." She said, "After the conference tonight, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my room and I'm going to call my daughter and apologize." And I think that that's a great place to start. So if you're somebody who says, yeah, I have a hoarding disorder, and I have children in the home or had children in my home while that was happening, I think it's always, like if there's the chance, I think that this is a mistake that we make a lot as a society. And it's something that I'm going to be very upfront. Dysregulated parent. My mom was definitely a dysregulated parent. And when I was a younger mom, I was a dysregulated parent. In the moment, I hated it. I had sworn I was never going to be like my mom. But this is where self-compassion comes in. Uh, how on earth could I have ever been anything but a dysregulated parent? Because I'd never seen that.
Hmm.
And so, my adult children, even my teens, we talk about scary mommy, and we're very vigilant about not letting her show up. But also being able to just say, I know I messed up. I know that some of the things I did weren't about you, but that they hurt you deeply, and I'm sorry. And with my adult children, one of the conversations I've had is, here's the hard part of that: the apology doesn't fix things, right? So we say we're sorry, but that doesn't actually fix anything. What I've told my kids is, now that the damage is done, even though I've apologized, here's the hard part: for you to get better, you have to go do your own work. I can't go to therapy and make what I did better for you. It's never going to happen. But what I can do is I can promise that I will go anywhere in the world to sit in a therapy office with you and to hear the really raw, hard parts of what I said and did. And you can know that I've done enough work that I can do that without triggering you and damaging you further.
Mm.
And, I know I messed up. And when you're ready, I'll help you find a therapist. And so I think that that's the piece is, you know, recognizing we can't fix it for our kids. And that apologies are a great place to start, but they don't fix it for the kid either.
Mm.
And so, if your kid is still a minor and in your home, find them a good therapist and challenge them. Like, I know that there's evidence that I'm not able to do this, but I really want to offer you the ability to connect with a therapist who can help us independently learn how to be healthier.
Yeah. And when I heard you give the example, right, like of your own kind of like early parenting experience as a younger mom and kind of the way that you're showing up for your kids now, not only apologizing, but I'm hearing kind of this commitment to like showing up and supporting and right, like listening and sounds like also like have like done your own work to be able to sit with the things that I imagine are really hard and uncomfortable. Um, that to me also seems like a piece of compassion that's not as much like the warm and fuzzy compassion that we always hear about, but kind of the like fierce compassion of sticking with stuff when it's really, really hard. Yeah.
Yeah, every day. You do work every day. I mean, I think that's the hard part is, we think that we go to therapy, what is the push now? Solution focused, brief therapy, right? You're going to go for six to 12 sessions and we're going to be good. And to be fair, as a therapist, I do forward facing trauma therapy, which is a gentler form of therapy, and we can do huge things in 6 to 12 sessions. But here's the catch. It's every day waking up and recognizing I still have triggers and having the skills and being committed to going, okay, I have to go down the hospital and sit in the parking lot because I'm avoiding my own care because I'm triggered by this environment. And that's not healthy. And being committed to doing that. Or like you said, the conversations with my kids and going, you know, hey, I that had zero to do with you. I messed up and I have skills and I need to use them. I'm sorry.
Mm.
I messed up. And then going and doing the work so that I'm less likely to end up there. But I think that being able to do, and then, we do our acute relaxation and my kids all know it. My younger kids who still live at home will even call me from school when they have friends who are having panic attacks and freaking out. And they're like, mom, can you help? Because they know like that I can be there, I can be present. I don't have to get dysregulated and I can help them learn how to regulate and calm down. So
This example, right, of like your kiddos calling you from school and asking you for support, like especially with a friend experiencing dysregulation, it really strikes me of like kind of like, right, like where you started from your childhood, right? Like this thing that you didn't choose, but is a part of your life. And just see like, right, how much work that you've done, not only like for yourself, but also hearing the last 12 years, you've really been such a support to, right, like adults and families experiencing, right, trauma and different hoarding related challenges. It really just strikes me, right, this place of like regulation that you've really been so intentional about getting to. Um, and I'm curious, is there, anything we haven't gone over that you really, yeah, want to let folks know who are listening, whether about like your own story or about the work that you do?
yeah, I think, one of the things that I still hear a fair bit, and the good news is in a regulated body, I can I can deal with this, is the adult children, they're just so angry. They're just so angry. And and again, coming back into the idea of emotional dysregulation. Well, anger is what happens to an uptight body, to a kid who grows up into an adult without the skills to manage their emotions and what's happening in their body. Um, And just a little bit like we talk about reuniting families. Families need families. And I'm absolutely like, when we look at 5% of the population having hoarding behaviors, we're never going to have enough resources as communities to deal with that. Um, and so, yes, I'm not opposed to the fact that families, we need families, you know, therapists need families involved. What I'm more wary of is families that don't have these skills. And again, going back to my own story. So 2009, we did hoarders. I did personal therapy, didn't do a ton of trauma work. I mean, we did talk about my childhood and do that, but we didn't do thematic work. We didn't really get to a place where I learned these skills. 2012, I started doing workshops. I was very aware that there were some things and some days where I wouldn't work with clients because I could tell I was triggered. And I was like, hey, like they all knew my story. But in 2017, we actually came to a point where my mother was developing dementia. We didn't know that yet, but she made some accusations around the assisted living facility where she lived. And my husband and I were united. We had done family therapy. My mom and I, we'd forgiven each other. I was compassionate. She was allowing us to manage her hoarding behaviors. Um, and so my husband and I were unified in this, and we allowed her to move in with us. That was our solution. Let's figure it out. We'll get caregivers to come into our home. Um, in maybe a very poetic, but also terrifying way, it became one of the darkest seasons of my life. Every time she said my name, I got these electric jolts through my body and, started having panic attacks. I had to leave work several times in crucial points, like because I was having panic attacks. Never had panic attacks in my life, right? Like, like a good child of trauma. I had generalized anxiety, but I had never had panic attacks. But I would start crying uncontrollably and start hyperventilating, and I'd have to leave, right? And it wasn't until several years later that looking back, um, I actually got to a point where I had a viable plan. I had set a time, I had means, and I was going to end my life because it was so overwhelming. And I was seeing my inability to do, gosh, I wasn't going to tear up. I'm tearing up a little. I'm going to allow myself to cry if I cry because that's part of self-regulation is I don't have to fight my tears. I don't have to be afraid of them. Um, but I was walking around in so much pain, emotional turmoil that I was impacting everybody around me, my coworkers, my children, my husband, even to some extent my mom. And you know, people say, I hear this all the time, suicide's so selfish. In that moment, it really felt like it was the most giving thing that I could do was to take me out of the equation. And so I just want to say in closing, before we can ask families to do this, we need to be creating families who are healthy. And I will just tell you this, whether the family, whether an adult child would say that they had a traumatic experience with their child, families where hoarding is a significant element of their world are not healthy families. Like, I don't need research. I'm absolutely okay saying hoarding destroys families. It does. I mean, my mom died. I don't know what her favorite song is, I know she liked roses. I knew her favorite color was purple, but I didn't, people are like, well, where are you going to put her ashes? Where's her favorite place? I don't know. Mm. Driving around, staring at other people, like that's what we did. I don't know. What was her favorite food? I don't know. I can tell you what she wouldn't eat, right? Mm-hmm. And so just the awareness that these are not healthy families and anger isn't bad. We need to be able to come into a regulated body. Regulated anger says something is happening that shouldn't be. And when we can do that in a regulated body, that's advocacy for ourselves, for our families, for others. And that is kind of where I'm at this point in my life is sharing my story and being really even grateful for those really ugly seasons because now that I've learned these skills, I can go advocate for others who are still living in a hoarding environment with a parent who's dysregulated and supporting them, challenging them to get the help that they need.
Mm. And I can't thank you enough, for sharing part of your story with us and also for like letting us like witness and like be with you in, right, like real emotions and that, right, tears can be a really helpful part of regulating. And I think, right, being able to hear your story, learn from your experiences, and also see like, right, the work that you've done, and the way that you model it is, I think, just so, so invaluable. And so we have so much gratitude to you, Cece. And I'm so glad that our listeners can also learn from you and kind of be with you in this moment. We will go ahead and we will link your information to your website if that feels okay. Um,
Absolutely.
and folks are welcome to kind of leave comments and questions below. Thank you so much for your time, Cece. It was so lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.